Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Patreon Q&A. There's a whole bunch of cool comments, so I'm just going to jump right into it and get going. Okay, I'm not sure if it really matters, but I'm going to start from the bottom of the comments and go up this time. I don't really think it makes a difference, but whatever, let's change things up. Tofu Man asked, what would I say is realistically the earliest I could have the ZSWorks set up ready for testing? And he wants to know if it has any equivalents in Europe. I believe that these ZSWorks boards are universal and will work with all HD TV signals for every region, so it actually would work in Europe. And I believe he said about 2 months until I can get one. He said he's going to try to get me one of the first ones off the next batch. I will be purchasing it for anybody that's wondering. And I can't wait to test it because I have a feeling this is one of those things where, if you need a gaming monitor, it's probably going to be perfect. But I think if you also feed it a 4K source, it might actually be fine as a TV as well, even with integer scaling. And just a quick little aside, the way integer scaling works is, in my opinion, perfect for classic video games and even pretty good for newer video games, but it will look terrible for video and TV because that's just not, it would look blocky. So having like the Super Mario Brothers Lego effect upscaling that way would look terrible, but it retains the original image of older games. But if you feed it a native 4K source, then you could actually take an Xbox One X or even an Apple TV 4K, be able to watch TV on it and still game. So I'm pretty excited to try all of those things out. I think I'm going to just get the kit for the 39-inch monitor so I could use that as my bedroom TV as well as another gaming TV. Don't forget I live in pretty much a normal people-sized closet, but in New York it's an apartment, so I gotta just try to be as careful as I can with space. But I'm just as excited as you are. I emailed Zeus again this morning actually just to keep in touch. And I will absolutely be doing a review on that because while it's expensive now, if more people jump on and this thing starts to get added to different devices and his technology starts to really take off, it'll become a lot more affordable, and then we could all have zero lag LCD monitors. My buddy Chris from Belgium chimed in on a couple of things that we were talking about. First, he recommends that you get a CRT projector for one in the 2000s and not one of the really older ones. He said he had convergence issues and focus issues. I've just dipped my toe in the water on reading up on CRT projectors, and I think one of the best things to do is probably get something that, the BVM equivalent. I think Barco had an amazing model, and I think Runco, which any AV guys are probably about to vomit right now, but Runco was a brand that would rebrand other stuff, but they did actually do a great job in doing so, and while they were notorious for doing like 1000% markups, you did actually get high quality stuff. So that's something I'm going to start to look into, and I'm really excited about, but thank you for the basic tip, and hopefully I'll have information on it when I start really digging in, and I can't wait to do a comparison of a 480p video on a new projector versus a CRT projector, as well as gaming, of course. But when you get into displays, you really cross boundaries of people who are into TV and movies are also probably going to get just as excited as video gamers. So it's pretty important overall. Also, he commented about the Commodore 64, the Ultimate 64 FPGA motherboard replacement. And he said he doesn't think it could output RGBS, and he thinks it could only do S-video. So there's a few different ways that I read that people were trying to get RGB out of it, but the bottom line is if it does HDMI, you can use an HDMI to VGA converter, and hopefully you'd be able to output the original resolution. And that's actually something I've talked to and annoyed Brian and Kevtris with about their I don't want to say clone consoles, their FPGA, NES, and Super Nintendo now consoles, is that it would be really cool to have a feature where it's just direct out. So it's the exact original refresh rate, resolution, and everything through HDMI, specifically for the purpose of getting a one-to-one signal out to a newer upscaler, which can then make it whatever signal we want, which kind of future-proofs things. Also, all of this talk of the Commodore 64 made me go out and get one of my a TRS-80. So this, when I was a little kid, I had one of these, and I found one very cheap. So I'm going to try to go through the whole thing, modding this one, and kind of using this. I guess to branch off to Commodore 64. So although they're not the same thing, at the end of the day, you know, this is what I had instead of the Commodore 64, a computer inside of a keyboard with the video output. So hopefully I'll get videos on all this stuff, but the Commodore 64 things did really interest me, and it's something, once everything catches back up, I'd like to start adding pages for all of this, especially when it's an open wiki and an open platform, so people can start contributing all the amazing knowledge that's out there. Colin Retro said it would be fun to have an interview with Extrems. I agree. I've made it clear that there's an open invitation. He can come on anytime he wants, audio only, video and audio, whatever. I think Extrems gets very frustrated with me sometimes because the bottom line is I'm not nearly as smart as he is, and I don't quite grasp some of the stuff he does. So I try my best to translate it, and all I know is I'm a massive fan of his work, and all of the little things that he puts out, it's so often that he says things like, oh, it's not really that important, or don't make a big deal about that. But they are big deals, and they're things that a lot of people, even that he doesn't seem to realize sometimes, no offense, but a lot of people really wanted and needed and are very important to some people. So I'm a huge fan of his. I hope I don't piss him off too much, and you know, it's always an open invitation. Dave Sobel was asking about the Wii, and specifically things like PAL versus NTSC, RGB versus component video, and etc. To be honest, in all the testing I've done, if you're using a stock Wii, or if you're using just a soft modded Wii, so you have emulators and stuff running on it, I would just use whatever's the easiest. So if you're in America, I would just use component video cables. 240p looks phenomenal, 480i looks like 480i, and of course you could also get 480p out of it. If you're in PAL regions, the only thing I would say is if you have a monitor that's compatible with progressive scan 480p, use component. If not, if you're just running it through a PVM, then use RGB. You say you're using both a PVM and OSSC, so depending on what you're doing, maybe, you know, either one would work. Most PVMs accept both RGB and component, and the OSSC definitely does as well. The only thing I'll add to that, though, is the Wii Dual that Citrus 3000 PSI Dan has been working on has the potential to be pretty incredible. And it does things like it bypasses the full Wii's output circuit, much like the GC video. So this is all based on Unseen's work. And you could actually have RGB, component, and HDMI all coming out of the same Wii. So while right now I would tell you the easiest solution, or the best solution, is to use whatever's easiest for your setup, but in the very near future it's probably going to be a slight, even if you're just using 240p, it's probably going to be a slight bump in quality to use that, and you get the advantage of both RGB and HDMI out at the same time, which anybody that ever wants to stream or game capture or any of that stuff, that's a pretty big deal. So, and you know, sometimes when I say streaming, people in their minds imagine like some of the streamer friends I have, like Carsey and Arturo, but the truth is a lot of people nowadays, because how cheap this is, you just want to kind of hang out and play video games with your friends. So, you know, a couple of you play and a couple of you just hang out on Twitch talking, and I mean, I think it's a lot of fun. So having more features like that just allow you to do things cheaply and easily is always a good thing. So for right now, I would just do whatever's the easiest possible thing that you can do, and then in the future, look into the Wii Dual. One other thing too is I believe if you're using an OSSC, I'm pretty sure the SCART input can be tuned for component as well. So if you have everything going into your PVM and you go out from your PVM into your OSSC, I think all of the inputs you just have to switch and toggle between, but I think they can handle component video as well. So it's not like you have to wire up something crazy. Just get everything into your PVM one way or the other and then out to your OSSC, and you should be able to have that, you know, without anything crazy. Jared Brown was asking about laser discs on flat screen TVs. And while I'm nowhere near an expert on laser discs, I have friends who are experts, and I've been bugging them for this stuff over the years. And the one thing you need to remember about laser discs is it's 480i. So on a flat screen, the first thing that's going to be probably the most important is getting a good deinterlacer. So obviously all flat screen TVs have this stuff built in, but usually this stuff built into the TV is less than ideal, just to save cost. I had a Panasonic Plasma that was, for whatever crazy reason, pretty great at deinterlacing 480i content, but many other TVs aren't. So depending on your setup, you'd want processors that were first and foremost designed for video, not video games. So for Laserdisc, upscaling to a flat screen, the OSSC isn't going to be the best choice. And then you might want to decide how crazy you want to get. I know some people that go Laserdiscs into a deinterlacer to make it 480p, and then they take that into a different processor to make it 1080p. It really just depends how crazy you want to get with it. But just the basics to start out with is just remember that you're dealing with a 480i source that's going to look that's going to be processed differently than a gaming 480i source would. So you could just try some pass-through devices that digitize composite video. Probably not going to be the greatest, but it's not an easy feat, and in many cases, depending on where you live and the size of your place, it might actually be easier to just get a pretty nice CRT TV and plug the Laserdisc into that. I know a lot of people that have actually just used their PVMs, and I'm always joking with my friends about this, but people are blown away at how good BVMs look with Laserdisc players, and well, that's because that's what these Laserdiscs were calibrated on. So depending where you live, maybe just picking up a cheap CRT consumer grade for a few dollars, or even going to the craziness of a BVM. If you can use a CRT, it's almost always going to look better. And if you're going onto a flat screen, it could get very costly to deinterlace. So that's why a lot of people, when they end up watching these movies on flat screens, try to get the newest editions or capture them and then use software to deinterlace and upscale. That's a rat hole I could talk about for a long time, so I'm going to leave it at that, and hopefully that'll start you off down the right path. Colin Kenny wants to know if the different versions of the Genesis will affect audio for the 32X as well as the Genesis games. And for the most part, almost all of the audio that you get from 32X games is going to be processed through the Genesis. So yes, it would be the same difference as if you're playing a Genesis game. And the 32X always adds its own complications, depending on if you're using a very cheap and poorly made jumper cable, jumper meaning from the Genesis to the 32X, you might introduce an extra audio buzz. There's a whole bunch of myths on the internet that the 32X improves the quality of the video or the audio. It's absolutely not the case at all. So I would just, if you're really looking to squeeze the best out of your 32X, you got to jump through a lot of hurdles. I don't put that much effort into my 32X gaming, so I just make sure to use good shielded cables. I use as good quality a Genesis as I can find, and then I just kind of deal with any of the shortcomings of the 32X. Even though you didn't ask about video, the number one shortcoming is that the 32X does add its own layer of jail bars and interference. So even if you have a perfectly modded Genesis, whatever's run through the Genesis layers will look clear, and whatever the 32X layers on top might have jail bars in them. This is something I've tested, and I think I've posted it online. If not, I gotta catch up and get around to that. But the 32X, the bottom line with that little mushroom box is that it's a gigantic pain in the ass, and it might not be worth it for some scenarios. So if your favorite game is Sonic and Knuckles, or you just absolutely love the Virtua Racing port, which I do too, yeah, do your best. But I wouldn't put nearly as much effort overall into a 32X as I would an actual Genesis. Dave Kircher was following up a little bit on the power discussions. First, he wanted to remind everybody that Power Plus adapter that HD Retrovision recommends, there are many different models available, and some that even look identical have the polarity inverted. So I forgot to mention that. Thank you for bringing it up. But to be honest with you, every time I buy one, even though I've already bought a whole bunch, I don't even go into my Amazon history. I still go to HD Retrovision site and click on that link just to make sure they didn't switch it up on people and I'm buying the right one. So good call. And also his idea wasn't to split DC power from the wall warts, as we talked about last week, but at the 120 volt level, that's over my head, and that's something that I think requires a lot more knowledge than just basic power splitting. And the only reason my gut is telling me that is just because of the work that we did, just simply based on extending the length of a DC cable in a medical grade scenario. There was a lot of testing that involved in that. So I think distributing DC and keeping the power conditioned properly isn't an easy thing to do. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's just kind of what my gut's telling me. But I will soon have a follow-up on all that power stuff and hope to really nail down the exact components that we should be buying. Carlo De La Cruz said he just did an RGB mod to his N64, and during the process he accidentally touched his soldering iron to the corner of the video chip and burnt a little piece. He wants to know if he should worry about it and if there's any issues. As long as you didn't burn through and expose pins and or worse, melt two pins together, you should be completely fine. Those chips are meant to be a little bit durable, and I've seen times where I've broken the pins on those chips, and Steve and Voltar had to Dremel them out and solder pieces back on to fix my mistakes, and it seemed like it was pretty thick. So if it's all working fine, I wouldn't worry about it, especially because it's an N64 and it's at the video chip level. So no offense, but N64s are pretty easy to replace, and since it's on that part of the chip, it's not like it's going to blow out any of your equipment. So I would just use it, and if it works, I would think it's okay. And don't feel bad, I've done that before too, and luckily I hit it in the exact position where it didn't matter at all. It didn't even touch any of the pins. So you know, no big deal. I think as long as it's working, you should be absolutely fine. Chris Larson had a question about building a circuit to convert RGB to S-video for use on a CRT. The first thing I'm going to say is be very careful with certain chips, because some of them don't process 240p correctly. They process it as 480i, so it's going to look terrible for games. But if you're having trouble looking for a wiring diagram on that chip, maybe look into the Sony CXA chips, because while I don't think you could find them new, you could certainly find a lot of either new old stock or pulled out of working systems. The only suggestion I have is buy a bundle. They're pretty cheap, so it shouldn't be too big a deal, but usually if you buy like 5 of them, 2 might have issues. But if you build a circuit with that, that's the same thing that was in the Genesis. That's what Renee uses in the DB Graphics Booster. And I'm pretty sure there's wiring diagrams readily available for that, where you could just run RGB-S directly into it, make sure you use a scope and build a correct buffer. I think it should be standard as long as your video signals going in are standard RGB-S 15 kilohertz. It should be a standard circuit that you put on the board. And then on the outputs, you'll probably need a little bit of attenuation, but all of this stuff should be documented. So if you're looking to build a device to make, then I would contact the device manufacturer for those chips and see if you can get data sheets and example circuits. But if you're just looking to build 1 or 2 for yourself, maybe look into the CXAs, because it might actually do a better job for what you're looking for. And it was used in so many consoles. I mean, it's got to be decent. We would have noticed over the years. So hopefully that'll point you in the right direction. Keith Marche? Sorry, dude. Keith asked, he recently got a cheap MVS board and 5-game bundle. He doesn't have room for a cabinet and wants to consoleize the board. He knows there are issues running RGB to a G-SCART or OSSC, but are the composite and S-video boards safe as well? I don't know, and that's a great question, and I would definitely err on the side of caution here. Most of these JAMA kits are, when I say most of, I mean there's probably hundreds of kits from different sellers over the years, and most are not good. That being said, there are a bunch of great superguns out there, and I believe the Home Arcade supergun is getting ready to have another batch out. But generally speaking, I would just be extra careful. And he asked, should you just wait for Voltar to finish the Neo Geo RGB chip? I don't want to speak for Zach, but as far as I know, at the moment, he's concentrating on taking AESs and doing a bunch of different things to them to get the best possible audio and video quality out of them. But that's using, you know, the existing setup and already expecting an output to, because the AESs are already built to output to consumer grade equipment, not to arcade machines. So I don't know that he'd be able to do that stuff with the same mods for an MVS. But that's something you should definitely look into. I'm not sure where you're located. If you're in the New York area, the iFix guys would probably be really great at answering that. But I think at the end of the day, you're going to need basically just a really good supergun that handles all of the outputs. So I really wouldn't chance anything. And the only exception it would be is if you really just wanted to play this on a beat up old CRT. I mean, this might be a horrible thing to say, but go pick up a CRT for 40 bucks, pick up a really cheap MVS to composite converter, and just use it. And if you end up burning out the TV, throw it out and get another one, repair it. It's probably just the input circuit, so you might even be able to repair it. As long as you're not using expensive or rare equipment, then I would think it would be okay to just chance it with some $20 CRT you pick up off of Craigslist or something. But I don't know. If you're looking for quality, even if you're just going to S-Video and stuff, I would really just be careful and try to get a really good super gun that handles all of that. Matthew Nola asked if there's an HDMI splitter I can recommend for streaming. Yeah, but there's issues. So I use the View HD box. I don't know why I have this one here, because there's one that also breaks out audio as well, which I think is better overall because it gives you more options. But this one, it's hit or miss. So if it works perfect. And yes, you don't have HDCP issues. I think put your capture card in output 1 and your TV in output 2. But I have run into issues, and so have other people. I think the one that never worked for me was this splitter into an HDMI to HD SDI into my BVM. I lost like an hour of my life trying to figure out why that wouldn't work, and when I finally just removed the splitter, it worked fine. So for whatever crazy reason, there are compatibility issues with this thing in certain devices, but it's very cheap, and you could find it on Amazon. And unless they changed the way it works, you should be able to do HDCP stuff with it. But just know that, you know, you might be spending 40, 50 bucks on something that doesn't work in every scenario. I haven't found a better one, and I would really hope that somebody at some point would make a matrix switch that does the same thing, but I'll keep people updated. Derek Hoffman and Rasmus Epsit were talking a little bit about audio quality, especially with that Marcus interview. And first of all, to answer Derek Hoffman's question, somebody actually transcribed the entire interview and sent me the file. So if you got halfway through and got frustrated, try again, because somebody took the time to write out the whole thing. Huge, amazing, awesome high five to that person. And Rasmus, so you're right in when you said it's probably not too much of a hassle to ask the guests to open up their recording software and do local recordings. But the truth is, with all due respect to everybody that I've ever interviewed, some people are hard enough to nail down just to get them on Skype and do an interview. And that's not an insult. I'm not talking shit about anybody. It's just some people have incredibly busy lives, and the half hour to an hour that they donate to do this is all they have. So I spend a lot of time on setup and configuration and testing. And even my audio quality, like I have no choice. I'm kind of a few feet away from a window in New York City by a hospital. So that's why almost every video I've ever done has a siren or a jackhammer or some crazy guy screaming in the background. All of those things are true, by the way. They're right outside my window. So no matter what, you're always going to have something, unless you're in a soundproof room with, you know, in a professional setting. I did find one trick that I finally figured out how to do correctly, is that my audio will now be split just in recording, not in post. Will go to the left channel, and the guest's audio will go to the other channel. And that way my audio will stay clean and proper. And if there's any issues with theirs, I could isolate and do a lot more processing. So even if I do something like add a noise gate to it, so every time they stop talking, the noise drops off completely, that alone would be a help in a lot of these situations. And I could have probably left Marcus's interview the way it was if it was like that, but he had a lot of interference on his end, and I wasn't really sure if it's background noise or his mic. And to be honest, I like Marcus a lot, and I didn't want to bother him anymore, so I just hit record and went with it. But I'm trying to find better tricks that'll make it easier on the guests too. So keep the suggestions coming, but you know, there's only so much you can do remotely. Paul Pastor was asking about a guide for cleaning controllers. I actually go by the standard console cleaning guide that I have up on my site, because controllers are pretty much the same thing. Basically, you disassemble it down to the plastic, and then I even have a video. You scrub the hell out of the plastic with, I use, for really bad gunky stuff, Goo Gone, which really gets the funk out of it. And then I always make sure to go over it again with just dish detergent, because that gets the weird film that the Goo Gone leaves on there off, as well as does a lot of great cleaning too. But that, I mean, it's a little daunting, especially with controllers like the PlayStation 3, where there's a million parts and they don't always feel like they go back in right. But I just, gross controllers give me the creeps. I'm not a germaphobe at all, but there's a few things in life that I have to like wash my hands. Holding onto the subway poles, I could tell you some stories about what I've seen with those that would make you wash your hands every time you get off the subway. And controllers for consoles, used controllers. So it's a little bit of a pain, it's a little daunting, but it's really worth scrubbing those things down. And the basics is you just strip it down to the plastic, scrub out the plastic, and then I always do a couple of things. I tap it on my hand so all the water shoots out of the little hard to reach places. Then I wipe it down with a paper towel, and then I use, actually, in the video right now it's showing compressed air, but I have one of these Compu cleaners, which is expensive. It's like 50 bucks. But at the same time, I mean, how often, if you buy more than a couple of compressed airs, this thing would pay for itself. So I, tap it out, I hit it with this thing to spray all the water out of the bottom. And then the last thing I always make sure that I do is leave it in the sun. Because it's not like the warmth or the light, it's the UV rays of the sun that kind of burn out the last little bits of water. And while at this point, it's not that big a deal, you still could do things like rust out a screw if there's still a water droplet left in the screw hole, or way worse, if there's even a little bit of water left, if it lands on the contacts, it could corrode and root contacts or short your controller out. So that last little bit of the puzzle, I usually do it first thing in the morning and then leave it either on a paper towel in front of a window, or when I had a balcony in my other apartment, I actually just left it out on the balcony on a table, and I leave it for hours in the sun to dry just to make sure there's no little bits of water left. But it's, in my opinion, a worthy practice that I think that especially with dirty controllers, it's worth doing. And then the good news is you really never have to do it again unless it gets dirty. You could just, spray a little bit of Windex on it and clean it off after that. So it's worth it in my opinion. Jesse Onland asked if there's a good guide for modding Genesis 3s, specifically for use with the HD RetroVision cables. Well, really good news, you actually don't need to mod it at all. It'll output RGB directly to that cable. The cable fits in properly, so that was the myth of some Genesis 3s didn't output RGB. It was actually that some cables wouldn't fit all the way in. So you're good to go with the HD RetroVisions. It does only output mono audio stock, but that just means that it'll only come out of the left audio. So you could just either only use one channel, or you could buy a cheap Y cable and split it to left and right. So it's still mono, but you're getting it out of both speakers. It's a pretty easy solution. You could get crazy and put the Mega Amp in there, and I believe there's already guides on the Sega 16 forums, and that will get true stereo. You said you weren't really interested in the fancy audio bypasses, and it is pretty hard to get it into a Genesis 3 into that small enclosed space. So in my opinion, what you're aiming to do, just use a Genesis 3 in the HD RetroVisions. I would just do that, and if you felt like you needed more, maybe look into getting a Model 1 and doing some of the more extensive mods to that one. Spencer NB was asking about Smoke Monster ROM sets and how to do it now that he's trying to legitimize the packs and make it part of GitHub. It is a little bit complicated the first time you do it. I will eventually do a video on it. I wanted to do it months ago. But there are still places to find the old Smoke Monster ROM sets. So if you just do some Googling, there might even be places on the internet where things like this are archived. You could find existing Smoke Monster sets that are still amazing and pretty complete. And then I would suggest doing that, and then following the guide on how to take the existing sets and update them with his new updates. I think he has that written out on GitHub. And it's still a little complicated, but if you start with an existing set and then add his updates, it goes very quickly. So I know that's not the best answer. I wish there was a safe and easy way I could just say, here's all the Smoke Monster packs, but doing it this way is kind of safest for everybody. Sorry. Hi Juice politely reminded me that I am a moron, and the official SD Card Association actually offers the Fat32 formatter for Windows free to download right on their website. I didn't even know that. Sorry, I'm usually not such an ostrich with my head in the sand. I think I've just been using DOS since birth, so the command line tool takes 2 seconds for me to run. But thank you for the link, and I will even update the page on my site with this link so that, and eventually the guide, so that people can just use this much easier to use thing. The only thing I think is you have to right click and hit run as administrator. I could be wrong, but either way, thank you for reminding me about that. I really should have known that and done some basic Googling before posting the command line tool. Sorry. Eric Hurley asked if anybody's done an in-depth video or tutorial on adjusting the geometry on your CRTs. There might be stuff out there on YouTube, but no one that I know, because it's really complicated and a gigantic pain. These are things that are on the long-term list for me to work on, but I don't know when I'm going to get to them because it's really hard, and it's just, I could show somebody the basics, but I'm not even that great at it, and the people I know that are that great would show the same basics and then spend hours showing how to tweak every little bit. It's very hard and very tedious. I think tedious is probably a better word, because once you figure out what to do, you just got to sit there and force yourself to do it. And with CRT geometry, very often you can get one side of things perfect, but then the other side of things, still, it's crazy. So it's something that all of us that are in my little circle of nerds want to do. It's just very daunting. So hopefully there's other stuff out there, but we'll get to it at some point. Shrink asked if a TV uses an auxiliary connector for component, can it cause more picture noise compared to a TV that has components soldered directly in? Theoretically, it's possible because you're going from large, thick RCA cables down to this tiny little thing that goes onto a 3-pole connector. But it's also short enough that I'm not sure how much of a difference it will make, especially because interference is often added in the long transmission of signals over analog cables. So having a short pigtail might not be too big of a difference, and it might even differ based on TV manufacturer. So it's a great question, and I think it's going to be different in every scenario. And just one more reason to try to get things like the OSSC, where you go component into that, and then that through HDMI into your newer TVs. But it's a good question, and just really not going to be the same in most scenarios. Everybody's probably going to be different. Santiago Sanchez asked about the GComp Switch, and he said My Life in Gaming's tests showed that a little video quality is lost when they used that in combination with the open source scan converter. And to be honest, I didn't really find that. That being said, anything you add in the chain of an analog device will absolutely remove quality. It's just, will it be noticeable in a practical environment? So all the testing I do, where I zoom in 100 times into Link's face and get every little pixel to make sure I could see everything going on, if you zoom in far enough and you put on a scope and you really analyze these things, there's always going to be some kind of quality drop with every extra few feet of cable, every device in the middle. But in practical use, I actually didn't find zero difference while using the Switch versus just direct. And I'm a little crazy with these things, but there could have been a bunch of factors. Maybe the consoles I used to test were different than My Life in Gaming's. Maybe the cables they used to go from the GComp Switch to the OSSC weren't the best, or they thought they were great, but maybe they had an issue. There's just, maybe their eyes see colors and things slightly different than mine, so they could pick up on imperfections that I couldn't. I mean, when you're talking about really nitpicking the way I tend to, there's a lot of factors that could be involved. But as a general recommendation, I have no complaints about the GComp Switch whatsoever, and I would feel comfortable recommending that people spend a lot of money on it, because it is expensive. But it's something that I'm happy to recommend. And please also don't forget, even though I've been accused of being a fanboy, I'm way harder on the people that I call friends than strangers. And I've known Super G for a few years now, so I would not hesitate especially to tell him directly if I found a problem. So, I mean, this is about as genuine a review and an answer as you'd get from anything. So, if any, just a little aside, anytime people that are my friends that are putting out products, if I review it, I'm way harder. So, like things like, any of Zach's boards, because, not to be an asshole, but it would be fun if I were able to find a flaw in a Voltar board. I would rub that in his face forever. So, these, please try to take it the opposite. Don't think I'm being fanboyish. Just know that I'm always being way harder on people that I've worked with, just because, you know, both because of that camaraderie and also because I wouldn't want a friend to put out something that has a flaw. I'd rather just be the guy that says, hey, I found a flaw, fix it before it gets to the customer. So, sorry, it's probably a really long answer, but just figured I'd tell the whole story behind it. Rasmus Epsit asked if there's going to be some kind of consoleizing kit for Woozle's Game Boy Advance solution. At the moment, you know, you remove the screen and put his device in there. I don't think that Woozle himself is working on something, but knowing certain people in this community, I have a feeling that Woozle would be happy to share the mechanical design of his board and let other people just design consoleized things around it. So it would be my guess, and while I don't know of anything, I'm not being coy and keeping secrets, it's just my gut feeling that once this thing's officially released and available to order to the public, Woozle will probably give just the mechanical design to anybody that wants it so that people could build a case around it. And I have a feeling there's at least a handful of people I know that would probably, even unprovoked, just be make a 3D print consoleized Game Boy Advance out of it. But to directly answer your question, there is no work being done on it right now. Everybody thinks it's a cool idea, but no one's actually working on it. I just have a feeling that sooner rather than later, there'll be a design up on GitHub where you could print your own 3D case. And I'm sure you already know this, but just for the record, that ridged edge, like, you know, 3D print look that you see now can be sanded and painted to look pretty good. So definitely keep your eyes open. And lastly, Door-to-Door Geek Stephen McLaughlin asked, any conference or events you plan on going to in the next year? A good event to see stuff or learn things and meet up for a beer? I really hope this doesn't come out the wrong way, because I don't mean it negatively, but I love going to all these shows. Cousin Scott and I have had a blast at them, but it costs a lot to travel to them. And I would love to go to each one, but if I'm invited, I will totally go. I will talk and hang out, but no one's really been calling this year. I think when I took a break, people thought I was out forever. But I do believe I will be at the Brooklyn video game booth at the Long Island Retro Gaming Expo, which is at the Aerospace Museum. That one's a cool one to go to. I wasn't officially invited, but Steve from Brooklyn Video Games did, and I told him I would love to come down and hang out and help build a little RGB exhibit, just like they did last year. And I wanted to bring a few toys too, just kind of show off. So at the moment, the Long Island one, I think in August, is the only one I'm planning on being at. But if anybody wants me to show up at any of these, the best thing to do is just email the events and ask, you know, hey, is RetroRGB going to be on there? And I would love nothing more than to show up with the Retro Roundtable guys, show up with Cousin Scott like we did in Canada. That was a freaking blast. So yeah, I mean, I would love to go to a lot of them, but I'm just kind of restricted. So try to get me invited, and I'd love to show up and do more of these. But cool question, and if you're around Long Island, I hope to see you at that one. Well, that's it for this week. Thanks so much to everybody for participating. I genuinely enjoy doing this. I'm always afraid that I'm rambling too long in these, so please post all of your feedback below, especially the Patreon-only videos. I really want to tailor this to whatever all you guys want. So thank you so much for your support. Please keep the questions coming, and I'll see you guys next week.